cover? Okay. So now we will have the official introduction. I'm going to just go ahead and hold this. Oh, wait, maybe I won't. This is new for all of us. Our first speaker, and who's the named author, is Brian C. Hales. I've known Brian for a long time. My introductions tend to be more personal rather than academic, but he has been writing and publishing books for a number of years. This trilogy, or the 3-volume set, I want to first of all commend Brian and Don Bradley, who is a collaborator, for creating these books in terms of the research and writing. I also want to give a shout out to Greg Coford for publishing a fine set of books, and all three at the same time and on time. It's pretty remarkable. Not for Greg, I'm just saying for any publisher to get the books out together in a 3-volume set is pretty amazing. And they're nice books, quality work in every way. Brian has written a number of books. I don't know why he tends to just stay on this one subject, but one of his earlier books, Setting the Record Straight, Mormon Fundamentalism. This one, he has at least 1 or 2 pieces in The Persistence of Polygamy. In fact, Craig Foster is here tonight, who is one of the co-editors on that book. Brian also did Modern Polygamy and Mormon Fundamentalism, the generations after the Manifesto. I'm not sure what printing that's in. This is a new one, new cover. This won the Best Book Award from the John Whitmer Historical Association. I don't know, he's probably going to say it, but this 3-volume set, the first 2 volumes are on the history of polygamy during Joseph Smith's lifetime. The 3rd volume is on the theology. I'm not going to go into a lot of credentials, but Brian has established himself as a respected author and historian. He is I count him as a personal friend. The thing that he has done here is tackled a subject that is incredibly sensitive in our history and in our theology. And just real quickly, Richard Bushman, who is one of our most esteemed historians, said this about the book. Brian Hales wants to face up to every question, every problem, and every fear about plural marriage. His answers may not satisfy everyone, but he gives readers the relevant sources where answers, if they exist, are to be found. There has never been a more thorough examination of the polygamy idea. And boy, once you thumb through these, let alone truly digging in, you'll agree with that. And one of the things that impresses me the most about Brian is that he does tackle tough issues, but he's not an ideologue. He's not so set on his personal views that he won't listen to other evidence, other questions, other concerns, and he addresses those. His mind is open on a subject that not everyone's mind is open on. Do you agree with that? Is there any kind of stratification on this question? So that's one thing that's always impressed me about him, is you can present another point of view, and he's willing to listen and deal with it. So when we have the questions and answers, I do want to make sure that, because this is a sensitive and controversial issue, let's just make sure that our questions are always civil, and that we know that we're all here for the same reason, and that is to learn more than what we knew when we came, and to have open minds. Don Bradley he's had an interesting odyssey in his life. He's a writer, an historian, an editor. He has a book coming out on the Lost 116 Pages, which, by the way, we have in our safe. I don't know that he's seen those yet. But that'll be interesting. What's the projected date on that, Don?
That is a great question.
Good question, yeah. So somebody asked that, and the question's answered. Maybe he'll know that. Yeah, apparently it's doesn't have a set date yet, but
not yet revealed.
Not yet. He's published a number of articles, and that one on the last 116 pages will be his first actual book, if I'm not mistaken. Well, if he wants to talk about his personal odyssey at all in his talk, he can. I won't go into that, but he's a fine thinker and writer, and we're glad to have him with us as well. So I'm going to now turn the time over to Brian, and he will take whatever time he needs, and then Don, and then we'll open it up to questions. Okay. Thank you again so much for coming.
Thank you all for coming. When we had my book, Mormon Fundamentalism, Modern Polygamy and Mormon Fundamentalism, Greg Colford set up a book signing out at Barnes & Noble one night, and I showed up, and Greg showed up. Nobody else showed up. The manager was there. She had a stack of books, and there was nobody. So this is a contrast, and I hope that you'll, when we're done, feel like your time was worth it when you came here. I'm not going to talk about necessarily anything that's doctrinal, though in the Q&A we can go anywhere you want. I'm happy to try to field any question. What I thought I'd do, though, is give you a little bit of history of how these books came about. And forgive me if I tell jokes that you've already heard 2 or 3 times or more. I tell people my books are part of my full anesthesia services, so I just caution you as you buy them. And I also will say that if you fall asleep while you're listening to me, it will not offend me, but I might send you a bill. So just so you're aware of that. People often ask me why I'm interested in polygamy, especially since I can't even monog. You don't need to worry about me wanting to polyg. But it actually starts back in 1989. A member of my family was excommunicated because she had joined the Allred polygamy group. And there's a lot of really good people in that group. She wasn't in it for very long. But during that period of time, I investigated Mormon fundamentalism and prayed the prayer, if this is true, lead me to it. And I honestly was just never convinced by their claims to authority. And wrote a book with Max Anderson, and that really is a very boring book, and I'm not sure I recommend it. Somebody asked me to sign one tonight. I didn't even know you could even find them anymore. But it was called The Priesthood of Modern Polygamy, an LDS Perspective, and that was 1992. And then as things go along, and there was a lot of things going on down in Colorado City with the Warren Jeffs and all of that, in 2000 and beyond, I could see a need for somebody to write a history of Mormon fundamentalism. Nobody done it. And even I would argue the fundamentalists themselves don't really know their own history. They have their traditions and things like that. And this is not meant to be a criticism against them, but from a historical standpoint, it just wasn't there. And so I put together the book that Modern Polygamy and Mormon Fundamentalism, the generations after the Manifesto. And I was grateful to Greg Colford to publish that, and Lavina Fielding Anderson, who edited it. It did win an award, and then 2 years later did the shorter version, Setting the Record Straight, on Mormon fundamentalism. And Greg Colford told me that as soon as we did the shorter version, the sales for the bigger version just plummeted. So there needs to be a shorter version. I don't know who's going to write it, okay? I would argue you can't write the 300 or 400 page version of Joseph Smith and Polygamy unless somebody has put together this level of information where you can go and see the documents and make your decisions. So that book still needs to be written. Will I write it? I don't know. I'm tired. I'd like to get remarried. That's really what I want to do. But But anyway, we did those two books, and the thing that was interesting is people would ask questions, because I was doing the circuit with Sunstone and Mormon history and talking about Mormon fundamentalism. And about half the questions that would come to me were, what about Joseph Smith and Mormon and polygamy that he did? And I didn't know the answers, and I, like most of you probably, had read Todd Compton by then, and Todd did an amazing job.
Game on.
Okay, here we go. So anyway, about half the questions had to do with Joseph Smith's polygamy. Didn't know the answer, read Todd Compton's book, and Todd really did an amazing job on the research side especially. Todd was criticized for some of his speculation, but to his credit, when he speculated, he told us he was doing it. And I respect him for that. Todd and I disagree. He wrote one of the endorsements, but in there he says there are areas where we disagree, and I still am real comfortable with my position, despite the fact that a very good scholar like Todd doesn't agree with it. But and maybe this is a good point to just say, if you want to disagree with me, that's fine. The only thing I'd ask is to bring some evidence. In other words, let's not argue so much just to argue. Let's talk about evidence and why it could mean this or why it could mean that, and we may have to agree to disagree. And that's okay. You know, alternate opinions are a healthy thing as we're trying to understand these documents, because there's only a limited amount, and some of them are quite ambiguous. So for anybody to come out and say that we've got all the answers, for me, I'm a believer. Just a couple weeks ago, somebody on Facebook called me the Sandra Tanner of apologists. And that's nothing against Sandra Tanner. Sandra's a nice person. I've met her, and I don't think it's a slam on her. I think it's a slam on me. And I don't like labels. Sometimes we kind of have to use those to let people know where certain ideas are coming from. But if I'm going to carry a label, it would probably be believer or something like that. But so anyway, in 2007, I started on a new saga, and it was to try to figure out what was going on with Joseph Smith and plural marriage. And the thing that really drew me in was polyandry. And polyandry, probably everybody knows what that is. It actually means multiple men, polyandry. But in the context of polygamy, it really is multiple husbands, one wife, more than one husband. And I could never get comfortable with the traditional view that was voiced by virtually every author who'd written on the topic, and that was that Joseph would sleep with one of his plural wives this one night, and then he'd sleep with another, or she would go out and sleep with her legal husbands, you know, the next night or sometime later that week. And that's how Fawn Brody portrayed it, and certainly we can come back and address that if somebody would like. But I was never comfortable with that particular idea. And that's what drew me back in, and I put together a little 115-page booklet on it, and I sent it to Lavina Fielding Anderson, and she, in her kindly way, encouraged me and gave me all these wonderful observations. You know how she does. And so I went ahead and put together about 300 pages, but I was quoting a lot of secondary sources, or I was fudging on primary sources that I really were getting secondarily. I'm sure none of you would ever do that, but at that point I was. And about that time, I discovered I needed some help. There's no way I could get down to the archives. I'm an amateur historian at best, and I don't know what I'm doing with the archives. At least at that point, didn't know much about it. And Don Bradley, who had helped me with some research in the early 90s on the early books, I was able to finally get a hold of him and employed him for a couple of years. And I got to tell you, Don's amazing. He's brilliant. And he, as a researcher, just knows how to look for things and find things. And so during the day, I'd be reading documents, articles, and things, and I'd be finding sources. And then I'd send him emails, and we created this documents to obtain list. The DTO list is how we called it. That was our code word. And I kept calling him Sherlock, and then I became Watson, because we'd be trying to figure out what does this document mean and what's going on here. And we would exchange documents Thursday nights or Sunday morning. And so this went on for 2 years, and I was employing him during this time. I wasn't paying him very much. I don't know how he managed to make things work with what he actually got from me, but I'm grateful that he was willing to do that, because there's just no way this could have happened. I put 6 years into it, just trying to go through the documents. You can add at least another 2 or 3 years full time for the average person to do and find these things at the repositories here in Utah. I went back to Yale a couple of times. But he was able to get virtually all of the documents. By the time that we ceased to work together on these things, the DTO list had a few items on it. Nothing was important. Couldn't find them, so we just set it aside. So really, Don was able to not only find every document that anybody's mentioned in any manuscript, in any thesis and book that we could find, get our hands on, but he also found a lot of new things that are very significant, and primarily the Andrew Jensen papers, and I'm guessing he's going to spend a minute and tell you about that. He had some inspiration one day when he was in the church archives, and I'll let him talk about that. But as you go through this, you'll find new stuff. Other places where we got some new material is I was able to get a copy of the Temple Lot transcript. For those who aren't familiar with that, in 1892, the RLDS Church wanted to take possession of the Temple Lot in Independence, and their argument was, we are the same church that Joseph Smith established, therefore we own it, just because we are it's just continuous and nobody else can own it because we own it and now we're that church. The Temple Lot, the Church of Christ Temple Lot, also called Hedrikites, countered by saying, we own this and you're not the same church because you don't practice polygamy, and Joseph Smith taught polygamy. So polygamy became a big deal in 1892 in these depositions because the Temple Lot Church wanted to prove Joseph had practiced it and taught it. And the LDS Church came to their rescue, helped them financially, and called a bunch of witnesses to give their testimony. And among them were several of Joseph Smith's plural wives, but others who were in Nauvoo and knew what was going on. This is decades later, but there's some very important testimony there. And many things have been quoted here and there from the Temple Lot, but having my own copy and being able to take it out and go through that really facilitated the ability to mine that for every good thing that I could find in it. And there's some significant things, some of which will probably be new to you. Other sources, there's a bunch of affidavits from 1869 that I was able to spend a lot of time with. They've been transcribed, and I had those. Also, there's the 1887 plural marriage article by Andrew Jensen that everybody's been quoting, but we spent a lot of time there too. So those are the big things, but you'll see some new ideas. But also something that happens is when you get all of this stuff out there, when you're able to put it all together, and let me just mention here, I do not believe this is a final word, no way. There will be lots of books written, maybe not a 3-volume set like this, but there should be more books written. I've kicked the can down the road. Don has helped with this, and hopefully we've got these scholarship out there a little bit for everybody. We spent a lot of time on the index. We spent a lot of time on the bibliography in the hopes that whoever wants to keep pushing this down the road doesn't have to start anew. Because when I began this, I called Todd Compton and I said, Todd, I'll give you $5,000 if you'll let me have copies of your materials that you used to write in Sacred Loneliness. And he was very kind. He said he'd love to help me, but he said he really didn't have a big file set like Michael Marquardt or Michael Quinn or something. There wasn't anything for me to actually start with. He said just go down to the archives, and that's where it's all at. And that's why I needed Don, and then Don shows up. So that worked out. But what we're hoping really is that for those of you who want to look into this, that the bibliography is complete enough, thanks to Don and especially his work as he's looking for things, because we found that in the different publications, there were things quoted over and over that just weren't right. And you could tell that they weren't quoting the original, they were quoting a secondary document and making it appear like a primary document was being quoted, and of course I would never do that, but anyway, and we've really tried not to. I don't think that occurs in these books, but it's something that we hope will be a service to the next generation of researchers on polygamy. I want to thank just a few people, and then I'll just give you a quick overview and be done. I thank Don. He's a dear friend, amazing researcher, brilliant. We just need to get all of the great stuff in his head onto paper so the rest of us can enjoy it. He has, it's serious. We'll get to hear from him in a minute, but it's not just 116 pages. Don has figured out what's going on in the latter part of section 132. He explained it all to me one day, and it's brilliant. And I won't go through a lot of other things, Don, but I don't know how to help him so that we can get these things out, but in time we're going to see it. He's also got something that's 3/4 of the way done, and it's a manuscript that can be a book on the Andrew Jensen Papers. He's got permission from the church to publish all 18 documents, and he's analyzed them. It's great. Almost, real close to being ready. Don? So anyway, these are things we can look for from Don. I also want to thank Greg Colford. I don't see Greg here. He's a dear friend. But he's also willing to put forth a lot of his resource to see things like this published, because this is not something that you could find very many publishers would tackle. And happen. Also grateful for Lloyd. I don't know, stand up, Lloyd. You deserve this. Lloyd is at Greg Colford Books. He edited Volume 3, which is on theology. And I can promise you I am less of an amateur theologian than I am an amateur historian. And what that means is I don't know how to present theological ideas in any kind of a coherent way. And so he and I had probably more wrestling matches than I had with Levina, but they were really big ones because I didn't understand at first, especially. And then later on I realized that Lloyd really understands how this needs to go, and I think he won about every battle except a few things that I wanted to include as far as quotes. But as far as I wanted to put a bunch of illustrations in there, I wanted a bunch of extra stuff in some of the chapters, and he convinced me, patiently, kindly, that, Brian, this will be a better book if you don't do that, and I'm very pleased with the way it turns out. I hope that you will be as well. But Lloyd is just great. And the other thing that Lloyd did is that he typeset all 3 volumes. And it's huge, but you'll notice there's a lot of tables in there. Tables are hard to typeset. And there's one in Volume 2 where I've got every wife that everybody's talked about and every person who's mentioned them historically and then as far as their compilations. And it's incredible. He got it all onto the full pages. So I just thank you, Lloyd. Amazing job with the typesetting. Can we give him a hand, do you mind? And then lastly, she couldn't be here, but it's my girlfriend of the past 5 years, and I say that sorry to Paul Anderson, but it's Levina. Levina and I have met secretly. We have exchanged a lot of emails and phone calls, and we truly have had a romance for the last several years. Though I have been noted to say that at times it's been a ballet, and other times it's been a wrestling match. If you've ever worked with Levina, she's a tough editor. But she knows her stuff, and arguably she's the best, or certainly no one surpasses her for being able to edit this kind of stuff, and she actually makes me sound good. I'm not a good writer. If I have a gift, it would be organizing, but the writing side, I know good writing when I see it, and I don't produce it very often, but she helps it, and she gets the idea, and then she makes me sound good, and I'm grateful to Levina. I wish she were here. I love that woman. Sorry, Paul. Yeah, it's okay. Sorry, Paul. But Levina has just done an amazing job at elevating this, and we're all the beneficiaries, not just me. Just as an overview, and then I'm done. It was kind of funny because we had two manuscripts. One was theology, and one was history. And when we went through, for those who've done writing, you get through everything, and you edit, and you re-edit, and re-edit, and then finally you're ready to send it to the typesetter. And the theology book was okay. It's about this big. But when Lloyd loaded the manuscript for history in, and I hadn't been paying attention to how long it was. We just threw in chapters when we needed them, and it's expanding. But he said, Brian, this is 1,000 pages, and that's if we use the larger format. And so he had to go back to Greg Colford and say, Greg, can we do 3 volumes? And that was the first time that we knew that this would be 3 volumes, and it's just a few months ago. Volume 1, and I'm grateful to Lloyd for figuring out how to split up everything. But Volume 1 is just chapters 1 through 23, just chronologically, one after another. Volume 2 picks up 24 to 33. And then, and this will be some fun stuff for you, there are several appendices. And they're all in here along with a chronology that Levina said, why don't you write a chronology? And then the bibliography, which is 70 or 80 pages, isn't it? It's long. And then the index. So if you buy Volume 1, sorry, all you get is chapters. There's no index, bibliography, or anything. So people would probably be buying both of these, but they're spendy, and I apologize for that, though Lloyd worked really hard to get the prices down. And at one point we were talking $45 a pop, and I'm grateful they were able to get these down. But Anyway, that's kind of what we have in volumes 1 and 2. The appendices involve all the information on the wives. There's a whole appendix on the evidence of sexuality in Joseph Smith's plural marriages. There is. He consummated 12 of the marriages, maybe 15. And I've got it all there. Everything I found, it's right there.
Pictures and everything.
Robert Gray says there's pictures and everything. Not so. Okay, just so you know. And then there's other ones on accusations against Joseph and against the Mormons of impropriety. And anyway, you can go through those. And then volume 3 is just the theology. And just a warning on the theology. Polyandry is covered in volume 1, not here. Polyandry, you could say, is a theological issue, but there's just almost, in my mind, no way to really understand the history, particularly some of these marriages, unless you understand what's going on with the polyandry issues. And so I spent 5 chapters in volume 1 on it, but arguably that would perhaps be better found in this volume. Thank you all for coming. We'll turn the time now over to Don, and then I'm anxious to address some questions here in a few minutes. So.
Well, thank you, Brian, for the lavish praise. And if you don't feel that you paid me enough, we do believe in repentance. I want you to know. My work on the last 116 pages will be coming out, but I'm waiting on Kurt to let me into his vault first. Nearly 6 years ago, Brian contacted me about maybe doing a bit of research for him. Little did I know that this bit of research would span 2 years and entail gathering every source that's ever been cited and anything that's ever been written on Joseph Smith's polygamy, and then sleuthing out any other sources that could be found, whether in Utah or in California or on the East Coast. You might wonder how Brian and I had time to pull off such a colossal venture, so I'll let you into the secret. We didn't have one wife between the two of us. Zerogamy gave us time to research polygamy. It would be accurate, an understatement, to say that starting out, Brian and I were coming from very different places in understanding Joseph Smith's polygamy. Brian didn't really know this at the time. He never asked me, in fact, where I stood with respect to the church then. He started to ask once, but then he stopped himself and said it didn't matter. Heck, he never even asked about the hair, and it was longer then. I let on to him that I wasn't active in the church and found it hard to have faith. But I didn't then, and don't think I ever have since, fully told Brian just where I was coming from at that time. When Brian hired me, I had absolutely no religious belief at all. I formally left the LDS Church. I believed that religion was mostly bad for people, and I thought that Joseph Smith was opportunistic and insincere. I believed that he was, like me, an atheist, and that he used religious claims to get money, sex, and power. Now, you may have gathered that that's a little bit different than where Brian was starting at. Gradually, though, over time, various parts of this began to change. One of the first changes was in my belief that religion was bad for people. A belief like that is hard to maintain when you see the role that religion plays in the life of Brian, not the movie, this guy's life here. Brian had a kind of peace of mind that I could only imagine, and he was incredibly generous and kind. While he tried to be frugal in what he spent on his book, He also tried to find a pretext for paying me more when my circumstances required it. He raised my pay not once, but twice. And once when I was in a cash crunch, he figured out that I'd only been charging him for research time and not for time that we spent consulting. And so he paid me all those back hours. Seeing that this grew naturally from Brian's religious devotion was one of several things that changed my mind about religion's value in people's lives. So now the only things that stood between me and being LDS again were utter disbelief in all things supernatural and the view that Joseph Smith was a scoundrel. The story of my return to faith and to the church is one for other venues, but the relationship of Brian's faith to his book is something that bears a little discussion, and then I'll tell you about one of my fun discoveries. Several times Brian had me explore possibilities that I initially found untenable, possibilities that indicated that Joseph Smith was religiously motivated and that his practice of polygamy was not as problematic as had been assumed. But sure enough, when I did the research, there was evidence, quite substantial and for me very surprising evidence in favor of many of Brian's hypotheses. While some might see the faith with which Brian approached the subject as a flaw in his methodology, it was in fact Brian's religious perspective that led to many of the new historical discoveries in these volumes. How? There'd been a great imbalance, as I see it, in the body of scholarship on Joseph Smith's polygamy up to this point. Its polygamy's sexual aspect had been looked at far too much, and the religious aspect not nearly enough. In taking seriously Joseph Smith's spiritual motives in practicing polygamy, Brian's work helps to provide a more rounded view of both Mormon polygamy and the man who inaugurated it. Brian has never been at all someone with an inflated ego, but just to make sure his head doesn't grow 3 sizes tonight, I'll move on from singing his well-deserved praises and instead sing the praises for a minute of the LDS Church Historical Department. It's common to hear that the Church Archives keeps the sources on sensitive subjects under lock and key, restricting researchers from access to them. But during my 2 years of nearly daily research there, I got an education in how the restriction process actually works. Documents are not restricted at the Church Archives because they contain difficult or potentially damaging information, but because they fit into one of several restricted categories, including sacred, like temple content, administrative, like minutes of the 12, and private, like records of individuals' church discipline. None of the documents that I requested access to were restricted because they contained information about polygamy, but because they contained information in one of those categories. So sometimes when I requested one of these documents, there was paperwork, but often the exchange between me and the church history employee went something like this. Church history employee, this document is restricted because it contains patriarchal blessings. You're not going to transcribe those, are you? Me. No, honest, I just want the stuff about Joseph Smith having lots of wives. Church history employee. Oh, okay, no problem. By making assurances like these, I got access to the documents I requested every single time as an ex-Mormon. So kudos to the Church Historical Department. One of the exciting discoveries that I was able to make there has to do with Joseph Smith's first reported plural wife, Fanny Alger. I found breakthrough information about their relationship in Andrew Jensen's research papers on Joseph Smith's polygamy that Brian referred to. In 1886, Jensen published a list identifying 27 of Joseph Smith's wives. While Jensen's list has been widely taken as authoritative, no one knew just how Jensen came up with his list. Significantly, Jensen was the first to publicly name as one of Joseph's wives Fanny Alger, who many regard not as a plural wife of his, but as an adulterous paramour. Since it was on Jensen's authority that others identified Fanny as one of Joseph's wives, it's important to know on what basis Jensen himself included her on his list. A search of Andrew Jensen's journals shows that he'd conducted interviews early in 1886 to identify the wives, but the journals don't include his interview notes. However, I was able to find them. I actually didn't come upon these notes in the usual way, but rather through listening to the still small voice of Robin Jensen of the Joseph Smith papers. And if you know him, he does have kind of a soft voice. Knowing, thanks to Robin, that these notes were in the archives, I found them. And on reading them, I learned something immediately that endeared Andrew Jensen to me. His handwriting was even worse than mine. Something that may amaze you if you see my signature in your books. Jensen wrote in such varied scribbles that sometimes I thought that it was different people's handwriting, but eventually I realized that his handwriting varied depending on how quickly he was writing, what sort of surface he was writing on. His notes contained considerable information gathered from interviews with Joseph Smith's surviving wives, and he identifies who some of these people were. They also contained his draft lists of Joseph's wives, lists that he added to as he learned more. Despite the difficulty of making heads or tails of Jensen's writing, I was able, over a few days, to transcribe everything. I then checked it, double-checked it, and triple-checked it until I was confident that I could read every jot and tittle, whatever those are. In the process, I became sufficiently familiar with Jensen's writing to see that there was one section on his original list that was not in his handwriting. I began checking it against the writing of people that Jensen had mentioned in his 1886 diary, including Zina Huntington Young and Emmeline B. Wells. The results, though, were negative. Until I compared this section with the writing of the prophet's plural widow, Eliza R. Snow. Eliza made very distinctive capital letters, and those on the middle of Jensen's list matched hers perfectly. To be sure I was right, I asked Brian and Jill Durr, who is Eliza's biographer, to compare the writing with me. They saw the match as clearly as I did, and Jill concluded that there was, quote-unquote, every indication that these names on Jensen's list were in Eliza's hand. Cross-checking this with Jensen's journal, I could even determine when and where Jensen turned his list over to Eliza for her handwritten additions. It was on Valentine's Day, ironically, 1886 at the Lion House. One of the names on Eliza's list was Fanny Alger. I also located interview notes in which Eliza told Jensen that she had lived in the Smith home at the time the blow-up over Fanny Alger occurred. The implications of this are huge. The reason Fanny Alger's name has come down to us as that of the plural wife of Joseph Smith, rather than just a paramour, is that Eliza R. Snow, who knew Fanny and lived in the Smith home at the time that Emma kicked Fanny out, understood her to have been a wife. Jensen was not merely surmising that Fanny Alger had been Joseph's plural wife. He got his information from someone who was actually in a position to know. Had Eliza had any doubt that Fanny Alger was the prophet's wife, and not merely a lover, the safest thing for her to do would have been to omit Fanny's name from the list that Jensen was intending to publish. Yet Eliza chose to include her. This is just one of many discoveries detailed in Brian's book, in which I've been so privileged to participate. If you benefit a fraction as much from reading these books, these discoveries, as I have in working on them, then you're in for a treat indeed.
I just want to point out it's really hard to cover 3 volumes in basically a half hour. So I'm sure there's lots of questions, and that's what we want to do now is entertain those. I think we can't really take this microphone past these speakers or it'll blast everybody out with feedback. So if you have questions, you're near the back, please ask them loudly. We'll call on you. So just we'll be happy to entertain a number of questions now. So you guys want to come over here and Brian, let you just field those, and then you can divide them up or however you need to do it.
I have a question.
Robert.
Tell us about the Lydia Moon affair.
Lydia Moon affair. The question is, tell us about the Lydia Moon affair. Did she marry and have another name?
She wanted to marry William Clayton. William Clayton had already
Oh.
married two.
Apparently he doesn't know anything.
Gotcha. Actually,
So we better.
no. Actually, I do know.
Oh,
do
you
know
do?
what you're
Okay.
talking about. Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, but all I can really do is tell you what George D. Smith writes about her in the William Clayton Journal. Lydia Moon is a woman who became good friends with William Clayton over in England, and then William came over to America. And Joseph learned that there had been this woman that William had become close to, not inappropriately so far as there's any indication. But then Joseph approached William Clayton and says, William, why don't you send for her? Well, William was married. I mean, he said, well, first off, I don't have any money, but then also it would be inappropriate because I'm already married. And then that's how Joseph introduced plural marriage to William. That's really all that I know about it, Robert. Sorry if that's not any more detail. We really focus mostly on Joseph in the books, but we try to hit on these other stories.
What, in all your research, what was the one thorniest or the most vexing question that you finally answered?
That we answered?
And what is the answer?
The question is, what was the thorniest question and that we answered? And what was the answer? For me, personally, and actually I'd like to hand this off to Don when I get done, because his may have been something different. Because we were just going in parallel courses. Don's brain was as much involved in all of this as mine was. It's polyandry. That was the thorniest thing. It brought me in. It's still hard because even though I think I've got it figured out what happened. If you were up at Calgary at MHA, Michael Quinn responded and disagreed with me, and he's written a 70-page article on how he disagrees, and I've written a 150-page response, and then he's written a 220-page response that I haven't seen yet, but I'm anxious to see it. He's promised me
Just on
copies.
the
So.
off chance, maybe somebody doesn't know what polyandry is, so why don't you just... Oh, you did, I'm sorry. I had to run down the hall.
No, when we
missed
started,
that, I
we did.
apologize.
No. Yeah, but thank you,
Sorry.
Kurt. If you
Okay.
see a need, please interrupt. And I'll just give you the short version. Except I should also mention that at Sunstone I presented essentially the same paper, and Todd Compton responded and disagreed with me. So these are big names who don't agree, and keep that in mind. But there were 14 women who had legal husbands when Joseph was sealed to them. I believe that 11 of those were probably eternity-only sealings. And you may have heard there were eternity-only sealings. There were, thanks to the Andrew Jensen papers. We have one that's very well documented, but there's other evidences, and I go through all of this in one of the chapters. I believe most of these were eternity-only. And what that means is the marriage really isn't on this earth. It's only after they die. And so you could almost take those 11 women off of the total list. And just so that you know, and I didn't mention this, I accept Todd Compton's 33 women, and I add 2 more. They're both polyandrous wives. So I have 35 on my list, but I believe that probably at least 13 and maybe several more were just eternity only for the next life. Now we don't have the documentation we'd like. People are pushing back on that, and that's fine. But those who want to say that there were sexual relations in them have less evidence than I have, I would argue. Now, there were 3 of them that were time and eternity sealings. Ben Joseph Smith taught that a woman who is sealed, that covenant causes all old covenants to be done away. I argue that in Joseph Smith's theology, no woman has 2 husbands. Because once she's sealed, that causes the legal marriage to be done away, as far as as his theology and his God was concerned. Those three women are special cases, but in two of the cases, the women had physically separated from the men, and so they weren't having conjugal relations at that point. And in the third one, it's a woman named Mary Herron, who you probably haven't heard. Big discussion in my book on her. We have one single statement tying Joseph to her. It's probably reliable, and we just don't know. So I'm hoping that the research will give us some more information on that. That's the quick version of polyandry, and that was the thorniest one for me. Do you have something that you thought was hard?
Offhand, I would say polyandry also. Particularly the case of Sylvia Sessions Lyon, because that's the case where we have the strongest reason to believe that there were sexual relations between her and Joseph Smith, because there's pretty good evidence that there was a child. So in that case, then it complicates the argument that Joseph's polyandrous marriages were not sexual. There's a very big discussion on that in the books, and that's actually one of the issues that I was referring to when I said that Brian had come up with certain hypotheses that he wanted me to pursue in doing the research, where I really didn't think that they were going to pan out. I thought that this was really quite a clear case of sexual polyandry, and then there was a good deal of evidence that emerged that would challenge that view, and so I think it will be difficult for people, if they look through that discussion thoroughly, to just assume that there were sexual relations there. Some of the questions like polyandry are really difficult. I think another partial answer to the issue of polyandry has to do with the timing of the marriages and also the timing of Joseph's reported visits by the angel. You may know the story of Joseph telling some of his wives that an angel came to him 3 times to command him to practice polygamy, and the third time he came with a drawn sword. Looking at the accounts that were given by Mary Leitner, to whom he was polyandrously sealed in 1842, the data that she gives would indicate that the first of those angel visits was in 1834. If you look at the women to whom Joseph was polyandrously sealed in Nauvoo, most of them were members of the church in 1834, and at that time they were single. And so one possibility is that Joseph should have married them in 1834 when they were actually around to be married, and then since he didn't, then he had them sealed to him later in Nauvoo.
Let me comment on that. That discussion point is not in the book, so see, we need Don to write more. That's it, because it's great. It's really good.
You know, I have a question. Joseph Smith had a very troubled childhood, as you probably know. He had a mother who had bouts of depression, a father who had an alcoholism problem. They moved just continually. He had a severe operation as a very young person. And he had a situation where he had to walk before he'd recuperated from all of this. In your book, do you discuss anything at all about any childhood problems that he might have had that would have led to a person that would later on practice something like polygamy?
The question is, if you couldn't hear, is that Joseph Smith had a challenging upbringing. He had the scalpel-wielding physician that cut part of his knee out to the bone, and his father may have had trouble with alcohol, and Lucy may have had trouble with depression. I'm not sure how documented those are, but there are certainly books.
They're very well documented.
Well, I guess. There are books written, The Sword of Laban by Bill Moraine. He really lands on that. And is it Richard Anderson?
Yeah.
Robert Anderson, that also hits on that quite heavily. I'm nonplussed by psychoanalysis that crosses 150 years and is filtered through observers who may have been friendly or unfriendly, but clearly weren't psychoanalysts themselves. I don't see any issues there. Life was hard back in those days, and I think you could look at most of the children. Very few of them would have had an upbringing that was that much different. You know, so the answer is I don't see any tie-in to it because I see such a strong theological reason. And what I mean by that is that when Joseph Smith decided, or when polygamy was being introduced, Joseph could have said, look, the Old Testament patriarchs, they practiced it. I'm a prophet restorer, I'm restoring it. See, Old Testament polygamy had no theology behind it. We do not know from reading the Old Testament whether monogamy is better than polygamy, is better than celibacy. There's nothing there. There's no theology in the Old Testament really at all, but especially on the topic of marriage, and there's almost none in the New Testament as well. So Joseph Smith, I argue, did not need to give us a theology to justify his polygamy. All he had to say is, they did it, I'm doing it. It's restored. Instead, we get this grand theological edifice, to use Fawn Brody's words, and I argue he didn't have to do any of that. His conscience didn't need to prompt him to come up with more than Abraham gave for justifying his polygamy. I believe that Joseph Smith gave us a very complex theology, some of which was complementary to Christianity, some of which contradicted it and brought pushback, and that he did it because he was, I believe it came from a divine source. But I don't see that was necessary, and I don't see that it was tied to anything in his childhood. That's my position.
One of my longer-term aspirations would be to do a Joseph Smith biography, and even though that project, if I do it, would be decades out.
Just do it.
I'm very interested in understanding the man, the whole person, and his childhood is part of that. We all have, everybody's neurotic, everybody has at least some little thing, you know, and so certainly Joseph would have been shaped a great deal by his childhood. I think in many ways he came from a rather remarkable family. They were very intelligent people. They were extremely religiously devout, very capable. The argument that he was kind of permanently psychologically damaged by his leg surgery is kind of drawing on research and theory about post-traumatic stress. And I think it is legitimate for people to ask questions like that about what sort of effect post-traumatic stress would have had on Joseph or on anyone else. There's also a phenomenon that's only more recently gotten attention among psychological researchers, and that's the phenomenon of post-traumatic growth. And often people, when they're faced with severe traumas, they actually become stronger because of it. And I think it's quite possible that Joseph may have been shaped in various ways by not only the trauma that he experienced, but by how he responded to it and perhaps transcended it ultimately.
But you didn't look at any of that in your book. You didn't discuss that in your book. Is that what you're saying?
I just never saw there as being a tie, so no. I do quote Richard or Robert and Bill, or at least refer to their books, but I didn't see that in the theology side as being a factor. So I'm told that we haven't got a lot of time and we have to give shorter answers, so I apologize. We'll be a little, but right behind there in the blue.
Yes. Is there evidence in the research that you men have done to find out that Joseph Smith had revealed to him or otherwise had information coming from above that he was to marry these women, and that's why he was after them and assembling a family that he'd received in the pre-existence.
You know, there's a quote from Joseph F. Smith that he said that Joseph Smith had people revealed to him, women that were going to help him with the introduction of plural marriage. And how specific that was and when he came to know that, we aren't told. But that's about the only thing that I'm aware of, other than what Don said earlier, that if you trace the women he sealed to in Nauvoo and trace them back, most of them were sealed in Kirtland. But that one marriage to Fanny Alger blew up in Joseph Smith's face, and it was so badly that Joseph didn't even want to do anything for years after that. That's my reconstruction. So
there is Mary Leitner reported much decades later that Joseph had said to her, she uses the words that he'd said, that I was his before I came here. Now, it's a little ambiguous, but it seems like she could very well have been referring to the pre-existence. But there's, like Brian said, there's really not a lot in the early sources that talks about that. Right here.
Does the church accept the lineage that you lay out for Sylvia Sessions' daughter, Josephine, in their archives for church genealogy? Are those descendants, and I think you refer to them as the Fishers and Bountiful, possibly, that, how do they record on a genealogy map that is so important to us?
So, as far as I'm aware, the church doesn't. So the church does have genealogical records, like through Family Search, but they're basically, from what I know, user created, and so the church, I don't believe, either officially recognizes or doesn't recognize that, paternal relationship that Joseph Smith had with Josephine Lyon Fisher.
Some may be recorded, some may not, depending on what the lineage chooses to put down.
Yeah, it would be up to the individual families. Wayne back.
Yeah, you've addressed, I think, from a polygamous aspect, this point of Joseph Smith marrying women that he may have been indicated in the pre-existence. But did you find anything that was in Joseph's mind a theological justification for polyandry as opposed to polygamy?
the question is there a theological explanation for polyandry? And yes, and this would be it. I think Joseph Smith taught that there is no exalted man alone or no exalted woman alone. You're only exalted in his theology as couples. And these women, several of the women who had legal husbands, their husbands were not members. One of them was not active member. So these women could not be sealed to their legal husbands. That would mean they are not candidates for the highest level of the celestial kingdom as described by Joseph Smith. I'll get to that. Yeah. And this is the case that we have Ruth Vo Sayers. Sorry, this isn't the short answer, Kurt, but Ruth Vo Sayers' husband was a non-member. He didn't believe in the church. He liked Joseph. He encouraged his wife, and this is well documented, it's new, to go and be sealed to Joseph. And so it says she was sealed to him for eternity. So we have this example for a woman who was not, who was married to a non-member. Now, of those 14 women, 9 of them, 10 of them, anyway, most of them, were married to men who were active members of the church. And this is a puzzler. But Joseph Smith taught, and Lucy Walker, one of his plural wives, quoted it. She said, Joseph Smith taught the woman would have her choice. And if that were true, then the conclusion, as strange as it is, and there's more than one strange thing as we put these pieces together, but this is one of them, is that these women chose Joseph over their legal husbands as an eternal husband. And what's interesting is we have no complaints from any of the husbands regarding Joseph allowing these sealings. At least two of the husbands complained about losing their wives. They were sad about that, and they expressed that. But there's not a single complaint about any of the women, from any of the women, from any of the men, from any of the people who apparently knew about these sealings regarding what was going on. So that's the conclusion, is that they chose Joseph, and Joseph said yes. There's a hand over here.
I'm interested in knowing what you have to do to be able to do research in the church's, records. Do you, and as you do that, are you able to use copy machines to copy documents? How do you do that? How do you qualify for that?
Well, let the pro tell you.
There are changing policies frequently at the church archives. I started using the church archives originally when I was 17, so the policies have changed a little bit. At various times, I know that they have had new researchers just fill out a little form. I don't know if it's exactly that formal now or not, but the form was pretty simple, name and where you're from, kind of thing, and then your research interests. I know that they like to keep track of that because occasionally, and once in a blue moon, there have been people who have been researching something that, if they'd known that the person was researching that thing, they wouldn't have given them access to certain documents. So for instance, someone did a paper on the second anointing years ago, and he had told them he was researching one thing, not told them he was researching that, and so he got in trouble. It's like I said, there are some things that are in the category of sacred, and so they wouldn't want people transcribing those. But anyway, you just go down to the Church History Library there on North Temple, and they're very helpful. As far as, I think you asked about photocopies.
Yeah.
For most things, they don't allow photocopies. Now with things being digitized, there would be the possibility of even getting digital copies of things. I don't know for sure whether I think in most cases they don't allow that. I think there may be occasional exceptions. Actually, things from the church, the historical department is divided into the church archives and the church library. The church library materials usually can be photocopied, but the church archives materials generally cannot.
Do you take a laptop?
Yeah, you can take a laptop, definitely.
Got a question. Okay, hang on. Let's see if we've got somebody that hasn't asked one yet. Let me just say something real quick. Now, we've already gone past the time we usually do for this, so we don't want to keep it too long, but would you like to answer some more questions?
Sure.
Okay, we don't want this to be too long for you because we still want you to be able to get your books and then enjoy some of the refreshments. So we'll answer some more questions then.
Two quick questions. Back to the polyandry. There was a case where, remember the Quorum of the 12 is on a mission. Someone help me. Orson Pratt or Orson Hyde?
Orson Hyde.
I get the Orsons mixed up. Okay. If you address that.
Actually,
issue-
both of them.
Both of them?
There's evidence that both were approached.
And then second, follow up to that, William Marks made some comments after the martyrdom regarding Joseph's attitude towards polygamy. Joseph didn't take any wives for the last, 8 months of his life or something like that.
November to the martyrdom.
The martyrdom. Did you find any evidence that there was a change of heart with Joseph or a change of attitude, anything along those lines regarding what he had done in the church?
Okay, let me answer the second one first so I don't forget. The question is, did we find any change of heart in Joseph Smith in those latter months? Because he didn't take any new wives after November. And part of this may be because William Marks left at least 2 or 3 accounts that Joseph had approached him and said, get the Nauvoo High Council involved and let's either get these people out of polygamy or excommunicate them. those quotes from William Marks, and William Marks was the stake president. He was like a general authority today. I mean, he was well respected, and he was a good man. He didn't accept polygamy. But the whole quote is just full of problems, and we go through and analyze all of that. There's just no indication that Joseph was giving it up as a principle, just because he himself stopped marrying new wives. So, and there's just problems. Why would you ask the Nauvoo High Council to go through and excommunicate the apostles who held a higher authority? In addition, Joseph authorized every single plural marriage. He knew every single polygamist that was authorized in Nauvoo. He didn't have to send the stake president out on a witch hunt trying to find all these. So there's lots of problems with that recollection. But what is an interesting find is that Joseph Smith dictated the revelation on the 12th of July, and Hiram took it to Emma, and Emma didn't accept it, and Hiram got a talking to. She was bitter and angry. But what happened is that the next day there's a big meeting, and I'm convinced Emma was threatening him with divorce. And to prevent this, he did two things, one of which we have documented in William Clayton's journal, and that is that he had a lot of property signed over to Emma, so that if the marriage broke up or Joseph was killed, Emma would still have some property and some means. The second thing that we observe is that Joseph agreed to marry no more plural wives without Emma's permission. There were only two after that. One is Melissa Lott at the end of September. And even though Emma was on the warpath throughout August, we seem to find in September a softening, because that's when she gets her own temple endowments and works as the matron to allow other women into the endowed quorum. But during this period, Joseph is sealed to Melissa Lott, and Melissa left her testimony in the Temple Lot trial saying that Emma knew all about it. We don't have a secondary verification of that, but that's what Melissa said. And then the other sealing came in November. It was Fanny Young. This is Brigham's sister, and it's in the context of her. She said, "Oh, I just want to be an angel and be sealed in heaven." And Joseph responded, "You speak very foolishly. Brigham, seal her to me so she'll have a husband in the next life." So it's an eternity-only context for that marriage. The second question that you asked was about Miranda and Miranda Hyde. Joseph Smith, there's two sealing dates for Miranda. One is 1842, spring or April. It's hard for me to tell which word it is. Orson Hyde is in Palestine, or on his way there. And you got to ask yourself, why would Joseph be sealed to Orson's legal wife while Orson's away? The answer to that, it's a puzzler. It's possible. The naturalist is just going to say, oh, Joseph wanted to have sex with her, and so he married her. But there's no evidence of sexual relations there. I think it was an eternity-only sealing. The believer would say, probably Miranda learned about eternal marriage and says, I'd rather have you, Joseph, to be my eternal husband, not Orson. The other possibility is we have two dates. Miranda signed an affidavit in 1869 and gave May of 1843 as the sealing date for Joseph. So the first one may have just been an error. We don't know. But here's where there's enough ambiguity that people will believe what they choose to believe. The issue with Orson Pratt's wife, Sarah, is very difficult because a lot of the information comes through John Bennett, who I argue never once talked to Joseph about polygamy, and have a whole chapter on that. But it's filtered through him. It appears that Joseph talked to Sarah Pratt about something. And Sarah said it was a proposal, and then somebody said it was a dastardly attempt on her virtue. So take your pick, somewhere in between. But one interpretation is that Joseph approached her for sex and she turned him down. The believer would say that Joseph had heard that Sarah and John Bennett were sexually involved, and the evidence is strong they were, and that Joseph intervened, and we have one source on that. And during the process says, look, if you don't want to be sealed to Orson, then you can be sealed to me, or something along those lines. So that would be the more apologetic interpretation, but again, lots of ambiguities there, and there was a hand in the back.
In the Nauvoo Expositor, there's an article that says Joseph was marrying young girls as they came off the boat. Is there any evidence of that at all?
The question is, in the Expositor, there's evidence that Joseph was marrying girls right off the boat. I think all of his plural wives had been there in Nauvoo for some time, so I would say I have encountered nothing. Don? No.
So it's a baseless rumor?
Maybe,
I have not found any evidence to support it. So,
how about one more?
one more question then. let's see, somebody has, have you asked one? Go ahead.
Two very related questions. What evidence did you find? How many people did Joseph Smith, how many sealings did Joseph Smith perform that were not his own? Number one. And do you have any indication of how many people were practicing, the number of people that were practicing polygamy that were not killed by Joseph Smith?
Okay, the question is, how many sealings did Joseph Smith perform? My research says that at the time of the martyrdom, there were 115 men and women who had entered into plural marriages, and there's a chart in the first chapter, you'll see it there. George D. Smith gives a much higher number, and I've looked at why they're different. I think he uses a few marriages that maybe are not reliable, but it's somewhere in that range, is what we would say. Then the second part of the question was, how many marriages were there in Nauvoo that were not authorized by Joseph Smith? And this is interesting because it ties into a couple of phenomena that were going on. One is that John C. Bennett, who again I maintain was never a polygamy insider, but he was an adulterer who came to Nauvoo and continued his adulteries. And at some point he hears about polygamy and starts to exploit it. But he had, following him, and we've got evidence because once Bennett left, the Nauvoo High Council got involved. And Gary Berger, I see back there, has got a great article on that, who I quote. But on the Nauvoo High Council and how they are excommunicating all these people committing adultery. And many of them were involved with the spiritual wifery of John C. Bennett. And those numbers at that point, and this is June of 1842, there were more people involved with John C. Bennett's spiritual wifery. And it's not wifery, there was no marriage ceremony, it's just one-night stands, that's all they are. But there were more people involved then with the spiritual wifery than there were authorized polygamists in Nauvoo, because at the end of 1842, there was Joseph Smith, who had several wives, Brigham Young had one plural wife, Heber C. Kimball had one plural wife, Vincent Knight had one plural wife, but he had died in the end of June. And so we had very few polygamists at that time.
How many of those sealings were performed by Joseph Smith? Do you know?
None of them.
That were not his own.
Oh, those there were 115 women. Of those, 35 are his wives plus him, so 36 from 115. There were 29 men, and is that 51 women? Oh, well, there were monogamous sealings, and I don't take those into account. There are a lot of those, but those were mostly in 43 and early 44. And I heard Ann, who's really smart, say Levi Hancock. I'm not aware of that one. Actually, George D. Smith quotes it, but there's a problem. Well, and I'm working off my memory here, but he's not one of the early ones, so I think George lists him as one, and I researched that down, and the data is just problematic. There's a date on when his wife died. And there's an early date and there's a late date. If it's a late date, then he's a polygamist for a few months, and if it's the early date, then he just remarries. And I found some pretty good evidence that it's consecutive marriages, not polygamous. So, do we have time for? We've got it.
I have a comment. It's William Smith in New England. He gives the sealing power to George J. Adams and Sam Brannan, and the three of them run up and down New England coast, marrying plural wives. Well, they do sealing, monogamous sealings as well, but then they also are doing polygamous sealings. So but those aren't authorized in Nauvoo. Brigham Young later said, okay, they are authorized, but
he's not somebody that you'd have to have a fourth volume to talk about all the crazy things William Smith did. So I hate to end on that note, but I think we're out of time. Oh, wait, Don has a comment.
Yeah, I actually didn't realize that you were Connell O'Donovan. I was going to tell you that Connell O'Donovan is working on a book on be sure to look at that.
Yes, I will do that.
Yeah, the opinion that I described once having of Joseph Smith being a sort of opportunistic scoundrel is the opinion that I still have of William Smith.
Me too.
I also wanted to make one comment on the question about Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt, both reportedly having their wives proposed to by Joseph while they were on missions. I think the lesson of those stories is not to be named Orson.
Ooh, Scott Carl made this.
So Kurt was mentioning, I guess that I gave some of my story, but then I kind of my return to faith, and I kind of clipped it some to talk about other things. I was actually out of the church completely for 5 years. I left the church, put in a letter of resignation. It was like 7.5 years ago on Pioneer Day, I think. I was rebaptized almost pretty close to exactly 5 years later, and I've been back in the church for 2.5 years or so. Within just a few months of being rebaptized, I was invited to do a several-month internship at the Joseph Smith Papers, and I remember thinking, like, don't they know, that I just am barely back from having been out of the church for several years? And although I asked it, I knew the answer, because one of the person who contacted me from the Joseph Smith Papers about the internship had been at my rebaptism. So that was a remarkable experience. And actually, shortly after I started that internship, which is finished now, at the Joseph Smith Papers, I had a chance to talk with Elder Marlon K. Jensen, who was 70 and the church historian. And he told me, he said, I want you to know that we know all about your little detour that you took in your faith, the 5-year atheism detour. He said, it doesn't matter.
Thank you so much to our authors and to you for coming. This is longer than we usually go, but there seemed to be a lot of interest. So we're grateful for your questions and your interest. And now, if we could